Once I'm logged into my account, on my homepage, the first thing I'll see is a list of all of the active Clubhouse rooms within my application here. And if I would like, in the top right-hand corner, I can see a profile photo of my account. If I was to click on that, it's going to redirect me through to my own profile page, where it's not only going to display a full list of all of the details I've added to my account, but also a list of all of the clubs that have joined on the platform. And of course, if I'd like, I also have the option to create a brand new club of my own, in which case I just need to add in some initial details for that. But back on my homepage, I'd also love to show you how I can start a new Clubhouse room here. And not only will I be able to give this a title, as well as link this to a club that I'm a member of, but I'll also be able to add a list of moderators that I'd like to help me moderate this overall room. And then once I've created that room, you'll see that I've automatically been added to the list of speakers, as well as a list of moderators. So in this case, I have the ability to view anyone who requests to become a speaker within this room. And if someone was to raise their hand and request to be a speaker, I could review it within my list here. Once I approve this user, it's now going to add that person to the list of speakers, and their microphone will now have access to actually speak within our room. And finally, if I'd like to view a preview of that user's profile, I could click on their profile photo and it would display a preview of all of their information. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you how to build your own Clubhouse clone entirely out of no-code using Bubble. When it comes to no-code tools, Bubble is by far my favorite, as it includes everything you need to build your own database, design your own interface, and stitch everything together using workflows. When it comes to no-code tools, Bubble really is a full suite that includes everything you need in order to bring your app vision to life. If you're new to my channel, I've been building apps in Bubble over the past 3 years. And throughout that time, I worked alongside the Bubble team to write their How to Build blog series. This series took a list of the top products out there on the market, like Airbnb, Uber, and Instagram, and explained the step-by-step process to rebuilding those apps entirely out of no-code using Bubble's tool. After publishing that as a blog series, I had plenty of requests to recreate that as a video series, and that's what I'm now doing with this YouTube channel. Of course, I'd just like to point out that this YouTube channel and even this video has no affiliation with Bubble at all, and it's something that I'm doing within my own time. Throughout today's tutorial, we're going to be building out our own audio community platform, exactly like Clubhouse, which will include a whole suite of features to replicate the real-world product. Within the full course, I'll be breaking down how you can register user accounts, how you can display users' information on a profile page, how you can not only create clubs, but also display the information of a club on a dedicated page as well. And then from there, how you can create and host your own Clubhouse rooms. And within that, I'm also going to be explaining how you can build out a suite of moderation tools that allows users who are moderators within a room to better manage all of these speakers and attendees. This tutorial is also going to be built using the Bubble Flexbox responsive engine. So by the end of this course, you'll have a fully responsive application that's optimized for mobile devices. Look, there's plenty that I want to cover throughout this tutorial, so let's just open up our Bubble editor and we can get started. The very first thing I wanted to cover within our tutorial today isn't actually going to be any core user-facing features that will impact the user interface of our product. Instead, I just wanted to take the time to build out the necessary data types and fields that will be used to power our whole application. And if you've never built out a custom database within Bubble, this can definitely be a little bit of an overwhelming experience. So I'm going to be sure to explain everything in as much detail as I possibly can. But if you find yourself getting lost or I'm potentially moving just too quickly, I'd always recommend to pause the tutorial and just re-watch any sections until they make complete sense, just because it'll help you get the most out of your Bubble building experience. And now for our tutorial today, I've just created a Notion doc here, which is just going to include a list of all of the different data types and fields that I'm going to add into my application, as well as a list of all of the features that I'll be adding into our Clubhouse product. And what I love about Notion is that it allows me to just add a checklist of items that I can tick off once I've finished adding them into my bubble editor. So it just allows me to keep track of where I am throughout the whole building process. Of course, I'll be sure to share a link with you to this particular Notion doc, so that way you can make a duplicate of your own. But when it actually comes to building out the database for our Clubhouse clone, there's going to be 3 overarching data types that are going to power our overall experience. And if you haven't yet built a database within Bubble, a bit of advice I have is that when it comes to the data types, if something needs to be created within your application, that should be a data type. And then the data fields are used to store all of the information within that particular thing you're creating. So for instance, if a user was to register an account within our application, we would need to create a new user. So that would be the overarching data type. And then all of the data fields here will store all of the information we would like to register about this user. So things like their name, their username, and their profile photo. The other additional data types that I would like to add into our build today are just going to be a club. So users can obviously create clubs, which are like groups within Clubhouse. And of course, they'll also need the ability to create Clubhouse rooms. So our rooms will be a separate type again. I also have a list of option sets here, but I'm going to touch base on that in more detail. But the first thing I would like to do is jump over into my bubble editor here and open up my data tab. And what you'll notice is that by default, Bubble actually already includes a user data type. So you won't need to add this within your application. And the reason they provide this is because by default, if someone was to use your application, they're of course going to need to register an account. And so under our user data type, Bubble already provides us with an email data field. And they'll also provide you with a field to register a user's password, but they just won't display that in plain text for privacy reasons. The other thing I would like to point out is that you may see next to my user data type that I have some text here that displays that there's some privacy rules applied to this data type. If I was to click on this, what you'll see is it's going to redirect me through to our privacy menu within our database here. And what I want to point out is that by default, your user data type will have a privacy setting applied to it, which just means that users are only able to see the content that they create within your application. So let's say if a user wanted to create a Clubhouse room, as it stands, because we have this privacy rule applied, the only person who would be able to view and access that room would be the person who created it, not anyone else. And that's actually not the experience we want to create. Obviously, we want to create a social platform where multiple users can join a room created by someone else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this privacy setting here, and then I'm going to jump back into my data types here. Because at this point, I would just like to add in all of my data types before I start building out all of the data fields. Because what you'll find is that some of your data fields will actually reference the different data types. And so what you'll need to do first is add in your separate data types. So if you remember, I had 2 additional data types. One was called a club and one was called a room. And that is all of the data types I'll need to add. And now it's from here that we can start adding in all of the data fields necessary within each data type. So I'm going to jump into my Notion doc and we're going to start by adding in a list of all the data fields that belong under our user data type. So for every single user that registers an account, I just like to store these details. So I'm going to jump over into my bubble editor. I will open up my user data type and I'm going to start by creating a new data field here. And this is going to register the user's name. So this will be their full name. And for this data field, I'd like this to just be a text field type, just because we're obviously storing a text entry. I will choose to create that. And then the next data field I'd like to store is going to be the user's username. And now the username is different to a user's actual name. The username is the handle of this user, so they can choose whatever handle they would like. It doesn't actually need to resemble their real name. And this field itself is also going to be another text field type. And within our user's account, I would also like to store a profile photo for each user. So I'm going to create another field and I'll call this profile photo. I will set this field type to be an image because obviously I want to store a picture for each user's profile photo. I will choose to create that. And after we've stored a profile photo, I would like to register a bio for this user. So that's just going to be their about section on their profile. And this is just going to be a plain text field. And then for a user's account, I would like to add an additional data field. And I would like to register all of the people who follow this user. So I'm going to type in the word followers here. And in this case, I'm going to want to store a list of users underneath this data field. So every single time someone follows a user, I'm going to add that person to the user's list of total followers. And so for this field type, I'm actually going to reference our user data type. And I'm going to select that I would like to store this as a list with multiple entries. So as I mentioned, this is now going to be a list of users. I'll choose to create that. And after adding in the list of followers someone has, I'd like to also store a list of all the people that someone is following. So I'm going to create yet another data field, only this time I'll be calling this following, and this will once again be a list of users. So I'll set the field type to be a user and tick that this should be a list with multiple entries. And we're almost at the end of our user data type. There's just two additional fields I'd like to register. The first is going to be a list of all of the clubs that an individual user has joined in our platform. So I'm going to create a new field and I'm going to call this joined clubs. So every single time a user joins a club, I would like to add it to a list of all of the clubs that they've joined. And so this field type is going to reference our club data type. And of course, because a user can join more than one club, I'm going to select that this should be a list with multiple entries. And then finally, the very last data field I'd like to add is just a list of topics that this user has selected they're interested in. And now, if you remember in my Notion doc, I had mentioned that I had what's called an option set list within my overall database structure here. And it's at this point that I'm going to add those option set lists into my database. And so if you've never used option sets before or you're not familiar with the term, what they are is essentially just a different way of adding data into your application. So under our data types here, let's say if we wanted to create a way for users to select their interested categories. So that's things like, are they interested in startups or no code or even software development? You could theoretically create a data type called topics. And if you were to create this, you could add a field in this for the name of each topic, which would just be a text field. But the reason I'm not going to do this within my application, and I'll be deleting this in a moment, is because I then, as the application owner, would need to create some sort of page or way in my application to add each individual entry, whereas I just want to be able to do that in my database right now, and that is the power of option sets. So option sets essentially allow you to add a pre-vetted list of data that you can reference at any given time in your application. So it saves you having to actually create it inside your application. Instead, you can create it directly within your database. And the other way that option sets differ from data types is that if we had our topics as a data type, it would allow users in our application to create new topics. Whereas I don't want that to happen. I want to be in control of all of the topics that are created because there's no guaranteeing that our users are going to spell them correctly or avoid adding in duplicate topics. And so option sets just give me complete control over all of the topics within my application. And so I'm going to, as I mentioned, delete this topics data type that I've just added. And instead, I'm going to head to our option sets menu here. And what you'll find is that the process of creating an option set is much the same as creating a data type. I'm going to call this option set topic. And now what you'll see under the option set is that you can create a list of different topics. And so what I'm going to do is start by adding in some example topics here. I could say that someone's interested in SaaS. I could say they might be interested in no code. I could even say they're interested in startups. And I might even just add a few additional ones. I'll say they could be interested in marketing, as well as design, and finally development. And now because I have stored a pre-vetted list of all of these options within my database, I can reference these at any given time throughout my application. So let's say on a user's settings page, if I would like them to select from a list of topics that they're interested in, I could display something like a drop-down menu that allows them to just select from our pre-vetted list here. And one thing I will just point out is that when we do choose to display those option sets, these are just going to be referenced as display text. So each of these option sets here is just a single text entry. So you can kind of think of these like the data field equivalent to your option set. And these are just referred to as the display text. So the option that's going to be displayed is SaaS, no code, startups, marketing, and so on. But that's how we can add our option sets into this section of our database. But what I'd like to now do in my data types underneath my user data type is create a way for a user to store a list of all of the topics that they're interested in within our application. And so I'm going to create a new data field here, and then I'm going to call this data field interested topics. And in this case, for the field type, I would like to reference my option set, which is a topic. And because a user can be interested in more than one topic at a time, I'm going to select that this should be a list with multiple entries. And I will tick that that is what I would like to add. And that is all of the data fields I'll need to add within my user data type. So I'm going to jump back into my Notion doc here. I'm going to highlight all of these data fields and tick off that I've finished adding those into my database. The next list of data fields I'd like to add in is just for my club. So every single time a club is created, I'm obviously going to need to store a list of information about that. So I'm going to jump over into my data tab here. I'll select on my club. And the very first field I'd like to add is once again a name for this club. And that's just going to be a text field type. Then below this, I'll be adding in an about field. And this is just going to be like the bio for each club. So this will be a text field type. Then I will add another field, which is going to be the featured image. And you can think of this as the profile photo for this particular club. So this field type is going to be an image. I will create that. And then finally, I'd also just like to create a data field that references a list of relevant topics to this club. And once again, I'll be linking this data field to my option set list. So I'm going to create a new field here. I will type in the word topics. So this is going to be a list of topics. So for my field type, I'd like to link this to my option set list. And then I want to obviously select that this is a list with multiple entries because a club can link multiple topics that are relevant to it. I will then create that. And that is all of the data fields I'll need to add within my club data type. This one's actually quite simple. So I'm just going to tick those all off within my Notion checklist. And then I'm going to move on down to my room data type, which is the very last one I'll need to add. So every single time someone creates a room in our application, we're going to need to store a few different data fields. So I'm going to jump over into my bubble editor here, open up my room data type, and the very first field I'd like to register is the name of this room. So within our application, a user can provide a name for each room, which just gives a bit of context about what's going to be discussed inside that room. So this field type is just going to be a text entry. It's nice and simple. And then within each room, I would obviously like to store a list of users who are going to be attendees within that. So every single time someone joins a room, I want to add them to a list of attendees for this room. So I'm going to create a new field. And I'm going to call this attendees. And because this is going to store multiple users in it at once, I will select that the field type should be a user, and I will tick that this should be a list with multiple entries. The other thing I'd also like to register within a room is a list of moderators. So these are going to be users who have special permission to do things like kick users or even approve users to be speakers within a room. So I'm going to create a new field here, and I'm going to call this moderators. And once again, this is going to be a user field type, and I'm going to tick that this should be a list with multiple entries because more than one person can be a moderator for a room at a time. And while we're adding a list of users to this room, there's a few more I would like to include. The next is going to be a list of speakers. So these are all of the people who should have permission to speak within a room. This field type is once again going to be a user field type, and I'll select that this is a list of multiple entries because we can have more than one speaker at a time. And while we're working on speakers, I'd also like to create a list of all of the users who have requested to become a speaker. And of course, within our room later on, I'm going to be displaying that list to moderators so they can either choose to approve or decline those users. So I'm going to create a new field here, and I'm going to call this requested speakers, and I'll set this field type to be a list of users once again. I will create that. And then when every single room is created, I'd also like to give the creator of this room the option to link it to a club that they're a member of. And so what I'm going to do is create a field here, and I'm going to call this the original club that this room should belong to. I'm just going to abbreviate this though and call it OG Club. And later on, when a user creates a room, I'm just going to provide that user with a list of clubs that they're a member of. And they can of course choose to link that to that club if they would like. And so for this field type, I'm just going to link this to our club data type. And because one room should only be able to link to one club at a time, I'm not going to select that this is a list with multiple entries. It should only be a single entry here. So I'm going to choose to create that. And then finally, there's just two other data fields I'd like to store within my room data type. And the first is just going to be a way to determine if this room is active or not. So on our homepage, we're eventually going to display a list of rooms that users could potentially join. And I'd obviously only like to display a list of rooms that are currently active, which just means that the session is in progress. And so what I'm going to do is create a data field here, and I'm going to call this active. And so this is just going to be like a status field for this particular room. And I'd like to set this field type to be the yes, no option. So a room either is going to be active or it's not going to be active. I'm going to choose to create this. And then what I'm also going to do is add a default status for this particular field. So by default, I'm going to select that a room should not be active, because we'll only obviously want to make it active once it's in session. But then from here, the very last data field I'd like to register is just going to be a unique URL for this room. And the reason I need to create this is because we're going to be using a plugin today through daily.co, which just makes the process of hosting a audio room completely seamless. And essentially their plugin connects to their server where they host the actual audio room itself. And in order to create a way for our bubble editor to speak with that plugin, we're just going to need to store a unique URL for each room that we can then reference through that plugin integration. So I'm going to create a new field here. I'm just going to call this URL, and I'll update this field type to just be a text field. And of course, I'll be explaining when this will be coming into use once we get to that stage in our tutorial. But for the time being, that's the very last data field I'd like to add for our room data type, as well as our overall database. So I'm going to jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that I finished adding in all of the data fields under my room data type, as well as my option set list of topics. And just like that, you can see how easy it is to create your own completely custom database entirely out of no code using Bubble's platform. Once we've finished configuring our own custom database for our build today, we can move on down to the list of features that I have set out for us to build our Clubhouse clone. And before we jump into the core user-facing features for our platform, I just want to take the time to first build out some pages like our user registration page, which will of course allow users to actually sign up for our application. And the process of building a user registration page is actually pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to jump over into my Bubble editor here. And I'm going to create a brand new page from scratch. So I'm going to head to my page drop-down menu in the top left-hand corner. I'm going to choose to add a new page into my application here. And I'll be calling this the register page. I'm going to choose to create this. And once our brand new page has been created, the first thing I'd like to do is just upgrade this to the new Bubble responsive engine. So at this point of time, while I'm recording this tutorial, the Flexbox responsive engine is not the default option. It's still currently in beta. So I'm just going to need to upgrade this for the time being. And once my page has been upgraded to the new responsive engine experience, what I'd like to do is then choose to update the layout of the page. So at the moment, you can currently see our page within our Bubble canvas. And because Clubhouse is a mobile native application, what I'd like to do is actually upgrade the dimensions of our application here just to suit a mobile device. So if we jump over into our layout tab here, the first thing we'll need to do is update the container layout of our page. So I'm going to update this to be the column option. And what that essentially means is that any items that we add onto this page will be stacked vertically, so from top to bottom. And the reason I'm choosing a column is because when you build an application, you of course stack things from top to bottom, not side to side. If we would like to stack elements horizontally next to each other in a later point in time, we can definitely do that by adding in a parent container group, but I'll be sure to cover that in more detail when we get there. But once I've updated the container layout style here, I'd also like to update the preset page width. So instead of having this be custom dimensions, I'd like this to be a mobile dimension. And now what you'll see is that the width of the UI builder has currently been updated to 380 pixels, which is the average size for a mobile device. And one thing I will point out is that the wording here mentions that the width of our UI builder is 380 pixels. But with the new Bubble responsive engine, we're going to make some changes to the elements we add onto this page, so that way they can be responsive across all devices, not just the UI width that we're currently building within. And of course, I'll be sure to explain that in as much detail as possible when we get to that stage. But for the time being, I'd like to just jump back over to my Appearance tab here, because before I add any elements onto this page, I'd just like to update the background color of my page. And for the background color, I'm just going to paste in a color code here, which is roughly the same as the background color code that Clubhouse uses within their application. If you'd like that color code, it's FFAED. And once I've updated the background color, I can now start to add the elements that we will be displaying on our page. And the very first element I'd like to display is actually an emoji, which is the hand waving emoji that Clubhouse uses for their branding. So if we head to our visual elements here, I'm going to choose to just add in a plain text element onto my page. I'm going to remove the existing text within this field. And then because I'm using a Mac, I'm going to hit the Control Command and Spacebar, which is going to open up my emoji menu here, where I can choose to add in my hand waving emoji. Now, if you're building this on a Windows device, what I'd recommend doing is just Google searching the website Emojipedia. And if you search for the hand waving emoji, it'll allow you to copy and paste that across into this field like a standard text character. But because I'm on a Mac, I just have the ability to use that shortcut. When it comes to the actual design of our emoji though, I'd like to make this much bigger. So I'm going to head to my style here. I'm going to choose to remove the current style. I'd like to center this emoji within the center of the actual text element itself. And then I'd also like to update the size of this to be 70. And now you'll see that'll just make the emoji itself much more visible. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab because I'll need to update the responsive settings of this text element. And I'm going to start by choosing to update the horizontal alignment of this element into the center of my page. And then I'm going to unselect the option here to make this element fixed width. And if I was to set the minimum width of this element to be 0 and have the maximum width to be infinite, what that means is that this element is just going to be responsive regardless of the user's browser size. So if I jump over into my responsive menu here, what you'll see is that as I scale this page out, because this text element has no maximum width and because it has no minimum width, it's just going to scale accordingly to our browser size, which just creates a truly responsive experience. And when it comes to designing the responsive settings of our application today, this is a principle that I'm going to be following throughout the rest of my build. So definitely be sure to make a mental note of that. While we're here, I'm also going to update the minimum height of this element to be 0. And because we have this option selected here to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it's just going to make sure that there's no empty space at the bottom of our text element. It's just going to collapse around the text that's inside of it. I'm then going to jump back into my UI builder here. And if I just open up my layout tab again on my text element here, I'd just like to add 30 pixels of margin at the top of this element. So that way it's just not touching the very top border of my page. And now once I've added in my emoji here, I'm going to add in yet another text element. Only this time, this text is going to display the word Clubhouse. And when it comes to the design style of this text element, I'm going to add in my own custom font. So I'm going to remove the style here. I'm going to open up my font selection menu, and I'm going to search for the font called Cairo, and I'm going to be selecting the Cairo 900 option here. I'm then going to update the size of this font to be 30. And of course, I'm going to align this text within the center of our overall text element. And of course, from there, I'll need to align my text element in the center of my page. So if I jump to my layout tab here, I'm going to update the horizontal alignment to be in the center of my page. Similar to our previous text element, I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width. I'll then set the minimum width to be 0, leave the maximum width to be infinite, and then I'm going to set the minimum height of this element to be 0, making sure I have ticked this option here to fit the height of this element to the content within it. And now below both of these text elements, I'd like to start adding in some input fields, which will just allow a user to add in things like their name, their username, as well as their email and password they would like for their account. And so I'm going to scroll on down on my element menu here, and under my input forms, I'm going to add in my very first input field, and I'm going to update the name of this to be called input name. And this is of course where the user who's registering an account will be able to add in the name that they would like to store within their account. When it comes to the style of this input, I'm going to choose to remove the standard style, because I would just like to update the roundness of my borders here to be 20. And what that's going to do is just curve the edges of my input field there. And then if I jump over to my layout tab, I'm going to need to make this input field responsive on my page. So I'm going to start by once again aligning this within the center of my horizontal alignment here. I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0. I'm going to leave the maximum width as infinite for the time being. And this is an instance where I'm happy to leave the height of this element to be fixed width, because I'd always like this to be 45 pixels high. I'm actually quite happy with the size of my actual input field's height. And because this is a fixed height, that just means that regardless of how the page scales up or down, it's always going to remain this height, which is the exact experience I'd like to create. What I would like to do though is add in some margins around my element here. So I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top, just to space it away from my text element there. I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. And now you'll see that this input field doesn't touch the borders of my overall page there. From here, I'm going to then need to add in another input field on my page. And to streamline this whole process, I'm going to just make a copy of my first input field. Only this time, I'm going to update the name of this input field to be called input username. And this is of course where a user will be able to select a username within their account. And just to indicate to the end user what information they'll need to add into each of these input fields, we can jump over to our Appearance tab here and update the placeholder text that's displayed within this input field. And in this case, I'd like this to display the word username. And I can see that I haven't updated the placeholder text within my first field. So I'm going to just jump back, click on that, and I'll update the placeholder text here to display the word full name, just so that way the end user knows what information they'll need to add into which field. And now below our username field here, before I add in an additional input field, what I'd like to do is actually just create a message that's displayed if a user selects a username that is not unique within our database. So let's say I was creating a Clubhouse account for myself and I wanted to use the username Lachlan Kirkwood. But in some instances, there might already be an existing user with that exact username. And so I don't want the new user who's selecting that username to create a duplicate of that. I obviously will want every single username to be unique within my application. And so what we can actually do is display an error message on our page if a user was to add in a username that is currently already occupied within our application. And the way I can do that is by adding in a text element below this input field here. And I'm just going to have this text display the word username taken. I'm also going to remove the style of this because I'd like to update the color of this to be red. I could also bold this text itself. And then I'm just going to jump over into my layout tab here. And I will unselect that this element is fixed width, set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite. I'll set the minimum height to be 0, just making sure I have ticked this option to fit the height of this element around the content within it. And I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 on the right. And you'll now see that this element sits in line with my input field above it. But of course, I'd only like to display this text element if the value added within this input field is not unique within my database. And so the way I can do that is by unselecting that this element is visible on page load. I'd also like to select that I want to collapse this element's height when it's hidden, which just means that if this element is not being displayed, any other elements below this will move up and take its place. And in order to actually display this element, I'm going to need to create a condition that just recognizes if the username someone's wanting to select is not unique in our database. I'm going to want to then prompt this text message. And so I'm going to define a new condition here, and I'm going to perform a search in my database for all of the users who have already signed up and registered an account. And I'm going to recognize all of the usernames for those users. And I'm going to identify if any existing usernames equals the same value as the input username field on our page here. And if the count of those instances is greater than 0, I would like to select that this element is visible and tick that that should now be true. So essentially this just means that if there's a user in our database with an existing username that matches the same value as the text added within this input field, it's going to display our error message. And that's all we'll need to create for this experience here. What I'd like to do now is add in yet another input field below this text element. And once again, to streamline this process, I'm just going to copy my existing input field here. If I jump to my layout tab, I can just move this down on my page by selecting the next option. And I'm going to update the name of this input field to be called input email. And because I'm registering a user's email address, I'm going to need to jump over into my appearance tab and update the content format of this particular input field to be the value of an email. And this will just allow Bubble to ensure that the value of this field will now need to equal a valid email address format. And I'll show you how that looks within a demo in a moment. I'm also going to update the placeholder text here to display the word email. And then I'm going to make one last copy of this input element. I'm going to update the name of this one to be called input password. I, of course, will update the placeholder text to display the word password. And then for the content format of this input field, I'll have this be a password, which just hides all of the characters in it by default, which you'll see in a moment. And that's all of the input fields that I would like to add onto my page. From here, what I'm going to do is add in a button element that will trigger a workflow whenever it's clicked. So I'm going to jump over to my visual elements and select to add in a button element here. And this button will display the word register. I'd also like to update the style of this button so it looks much the same as the real Clubhouse application. So I'm going to choose to edit this style of my primary button here. And the first thing I'd like to do is just update the color code for this button. I'm going to make it a shade of green. If you'd like that color code, it's 35B353. I'm then also just going to update the roundness of this button to be 20. So that way its borders match the same curvature of my input field above it there. And that's all I'll need to change for my button style. What I would like to do is jump over into my layout tab, of course, and align this within the center of my page. I'm going to keep the width of this button to be fixed because I'd always like this to be 150 pixels in width. And I'm happy to just keep the height settings as they are as well. The only thing I'd like to change is just my margins. I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top here. And because this is the very last element I'll be adding onto my page, I'd just like to add 20 pixels of margin at the bottom, which will just ensure that my page doesn't actually touch the border of this element itself. And from a design perspective, that is everything I would like to add onto my page. What we can now do is choose to run a workflow whenever our registration button is clicked here. And in that case, we're going to register this user's account within our database. So I'm going to choose to start a workflow every single time this button is clicked. And within the first action of our workflow, I'm going to head to our account option here. And I'm just going to choose the option to sign the user up. And what you'll see here is that by default, Bubble will require you to identify a valid email and password for this user's account. And of course, I'm just going to set the values of these fields to match the relevant input fields on my page. So I'm going to say that for the user's email in our database, this will equal the same value as the input email field we added on our page. And then for our password value, this is going to equal the same value as the input password field on our page. And then what I also love about Bubble is that once you've registered a user's account, it also allows you to modify any additional data fields you'd like to change within this user's account. And so the two data fields I would like to change is of course the user's name. And I'd like this to equal the value of the input name field we added on the page. And then finally, there was the username field where I would want this to equal the value of the input username field on our page. And that's everything we'll need to create within this step of our workflow. One thing I would like to point out though is at this point in our tutorial, if a user was to register a brand new account, they would add in all of their details, they would click this button, that workflow would run, and they would successfully create a new account. But nothing would happen from there. They would just remain on this page. Whereas what I would like to do is redirect the user through to a settings page in our application, where they could then make changes to any additional information we'd like to store within their account. So they could update something like their profile photo or even their bio. And so in order to redirect a user through to another page once they've registered an account, I'm going to jump back into my workflow editor here. I'm going to add an additional step in my workflow, and I'm going to select from the navigation option here, and I'll be choosing the go to page option. The destination page doesn't yet exist, so we're going to need to create this within our application. I'm going to choose to call this page our settings page. I will then create that. And now I'll be able to select that I would like to redirect the user through to our settings page. And I won't need to send any data through within this workflow. I'll be explaining the circumstances in which you'll need to do that at a later point in our tutorial. But that's everything I would like to add and build for my user registration page. So let's open up a preview of our application and see what this whole experience now looks like. Over on my user registration page, what you'll see here is that because I'm viewing this on a full width browser on desktop, the input fields have scaled across the full width of my page. Of course, if I was to scale this down to be a size of a mobile device, you'll see that all of those input fields are fully responsive, so they will respond accordingly. If I was to then start adding in all of my information here, I'm going to add in my name, Lachlan Kirkwood. For my handle, I'm just going to type in my name. And one thing I will point out is that because my handle has not already been taken, you'll see that our error text is not being displayed. For my email, I'm just going to type in a test email address here. And then for a password, I'm just going to add in something very basic. I'm then going to register this account. That workflow will run, and it's now going to redirect me through to the settings page within my application, which at this point in time you'll be able to see is just blank because we haven't made any changes to this overall page. And that is everything I wanted to cover throughout the process of registering a user's account. So I'm just going to jump back into my Notion checklist here and tick off that we've finished building out this feature. The next feature I'd like to focus on within our build is building out the actual home page of our Clubhouse application. And this is finally one of the core pages that users will frequently engage with across our platform. And essentially on this page, like the real world Clubhouse product, I'd like to just display a list of all of the rooms that are currently active that a user can join, as well as a header menu and even the option for a user to create a brand new room themselves. And so I'm going to jump over into my bubble editor here and I'm going to create a new page. So I'm going to head to my page drop down menu. I will design a new page and I'll be calling this the home page. I will create this. And over on my page here, the first thing you'll need to do is of course update this to the new responsive engine if you have not. And from there, I'll be updating the background color to be the same color code that I'd used on my registration page. So if you'd like that color code, it's FFFAED, and that just replicates the same background color that Clubhouse uses on their own application. I'm then going to jump over into my layout tab and update the container layout of our overall page. In this instance, I'd like this to be a column, just because I'll be building the page from top to bottom, which of course is exactly what a column is built for. It allows you to stack elements vertically. I'm then going to update the preset width of my page to also be a mobile size. And of course, this will update the width of our UI builder to be 380 pixels. And now the very first item I would like to add onto my page is actually going to be the header menu that sits at the top. And when it comes to the header menu, I'd like it to display an explore icon on the left-hand side, and then a user's profile photo on the right-hand side. Which of course, because the container layout of our page is set to a column, we won't be able to do by default. So what we're going to need to do is add in an additional group on our page that's going to act like a container. And within that group, we can update its container layout to be a row, which means we can stack elements horizontally, not vertically. And so if I scroll on down to my containers menu here, I'm going to choose to add in a group element. I'm going to update the name of this to be called group header menu, and for the container layout I'd like this to be a row, as I mentioned, because I'm going to be stacking elements horizontally. And of course, once I update the container layout to be a row, you'll see here we have a whole suite of container alignment options that we can update. I'll be coming back to that at a later point in this module. But for the time being, I'm going to jump over to our appearance tab because I would like to remove the style of this group. I'm going to update the background color to be a flat color. And for the time being, I'm just going to want this to be a light shade of red. And now the reason I'm making this a shade of red is because I just want to be able to see where this group sits on my page. Of course, when I preview or publish the application, you can remove this color. But when I'm building with the new bubble responsive engine, I like to stack my groups almost like Lego blocks. And when I make these different colors, I can actually see where they are represented on our page. So I definitely recommend doing the same if you're relatively new to the bubble responsive engine. I'm then going to jump over into my layout tab here, and I'm going to update the responsive settings of this group on our page. So when it comes to the width of the page, I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and the maximum width to be infinite. And of course, if I was to open up my responsive settings, that just means that this group is going to be fully responsive regardless of the size of my page. Later on, I will also be updating the minimum height of this group, but I'm going to first need to add the elements I'd like to display within them. And as I mentioned, the very first element I'd like to add in this group is going to be an icon. So under my visual elements, I'm going to select to add in an icon element here, and I'm going to type in the word compass. I will select this compass option. And once I've added this compass in, I'd like to edit the color of this. So I'm going to edit the standard icon style here. And for the color, I just have a color code saved here, which if you'd like it, it's 474747. I'm then going to jump back into my design tab, head to the layout section of my icon here, because I would like to first of all vertically align this icon in the center of my red group. And because we're using a row container layout in our red group, any elements added within this have the ability to vertically align them, whereas you don't have the option within a group or page that has the container layout of a column. And then from here, I'm going to update the width of my icon to be 40 pixels and the height to also be 40 pixels. And I am going to keep this icon fixed width because I will always want it to be 40 pixels in width and height. And then when it comes to this icon element, what I'd like to do is create a workflow that identifies when this icon is clicked, in which case I'd like to redirect a user through to the Explore page that we're going to be building out in our application. And of course, the Explore page is where a user can find any new profiles or suggested accounts that they should follow. So I'm going to choose to start a workflow every single time this icon is clicked. I'm going to head to the navigation option and choose the Go to Page event. The destination page will be our Explore page, which we have not yet created in our application. So I'm going to create a new page and I'll be calling this page Explore. I'll choose to create that. And we won't need to make any changes on that page for the time being. So I can just select that the destination page will be our Explore page, and I won't need to send any data through to it. I'm then going to jump back into my design tab because, as I mentioned, on the right hand side of my red group, I would like to display the profile photo of a user, and I'm going to have that redirect them through to their settings page that we had previously created. And so I'm going to head to my visual elements here. I'm going to select to add an image element into my red group. And when it comes to the image I'd like to actually display within this element, I would like to show the profile photo of the user who is logged into their account. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and then from my database, I'm going to reference the current user, so the person who is logged into their account, their profile photo, and I'm going to select the option to process this with Imgix, just because I'd like to tick this option here to resize and fit the dimensions of this image by cropping it, which just means it's going to expand the image out to take up the full space of this element. I'm then going to choose to close that. While I'm working on this image, I'm just going to update the border of this to be a solid color. So that way, if I was to click away, I can actually see where the image sits within my page. I'm then going to open up my image again because I would like to set the roundness of this image to be 10, and that's just going to curve the borders of my image. I'm then going to jump into my layout tab here, and I'm going to choose to vertically align this image in the center of my red parent group. And then I will update the width of this image to be 40 pixels, and I'm going to keep that fixed width because I don't want the width to expand based on the size of our page. I'm also then going to select this option here to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed, and I'll leave this as 1:1. And what you'll now see is that it's 40 pixels in width and 40 pixels in height, so it's a perfect square. And now when it comes to the actual red parent group that both of these elements sit within, I'm going to update some additional settings to make this look more like an actual menu. So the first setting I'm going to update is the container alignment option here. And instead of aligning these to the left of my red element, I'm going to select the option here, which is called space between. It's the very last option. And now you'll see that it's going to put an even amount of space between both of these elements, which means they're going to be pushed to each side of our group. I'm then going to head on down to the minimum height of this element and set that to be 0. And because I have the option selected here to fit the height of this group to the content within it, it's going to collapse to the actual size of the elements that lie within it. And then from here, I'm going to add some margin onto each of these elements, just so they're structured more appropriately on my page. I'm going to start by clicking on my compass icon here, and I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels of margin on the left. And then if I click on our profile photo, I'm going to jump to our layout tab here, and I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels of margin on the right. And what you'll now see is that both of these elements are positioned away from the borders of our page. And that is actually how we can create our menu experience. The very last thing I'll need to do is just create a workflow that runs every single time a user clicks on their profile photo. Because as I had mentioned, I'd like this to redirect through to their settings page where they can update their account information. So I'm going to choose to start a workflow every single time this profile photo is clicked. And in this case, I'll once again be selecting from a navigation event. I'll choose the Go to Page option, and I'll set the destination page to be the settings page that we had previously created in our application. And like before, I won't need to send any data through to this page. I'm then going to jump back into my design tab here. because it's now at this point that I'd like to build out the crux of our actual homepage itself. And in that instance, I'd like to display a list of all of the Clubhouse rooms in our application that are currently active. And I'll be displaying some information about those rooms. And in order to display a list of items from our database, we're going to need to leverage what's called a repeating group element. And so if you're not familiar, if you head to your containers menu here, you'll see an option to add in a repeating group. And this is just going to look like a list of cells. And that's because that's exactly how a repeating group functions. So if you ever need to display a list of things within your application, particularly if it's a list of things stored within your database, a repeating group is how you would do that. So a good example is if you were building, let's say, like an Instagram homepage feed, if you wanted to display a list of posts with photos, you would use a repeating group element to pull all of the posts from your database. And in today's instance, we're going to display a list of all of the rooms within our Clubhouse application that are currently active. And I'll be displaying the details of those rooms within each cell. And the first thing you'll need to do with a repeating group is just configure the type of content you'd like to display within it. And so as I mentioned, I'd like to display a list of rooms. And then from here, I'm going to need to configure a data source to identify which rooms within our database we should be displaying. So I'm going to perform a search in our database for all of the rooms where the active status equals yes. So that means we're going to display all of the rooms that are currently active. And if I would like, I could choose to sort these in a random order. So that way, every time the user refreshes the page, they're going to see a completely different list with different recommendations. I'm going to then choose to close that. And now for the design of our repeating group, I'm going to unselect that this repeating group should have a fixed number of rows, because I want this to continually expand down and add in as many different rooms as we would like. I don't want it to only display 4 Clubhouse rooms. I will, however, be leaving the option to fix the number of columns as 1, just because I only want to display 1 room per cell line. But in order to also add in some additional space to work within my repeating group, I'm going to update the minimum height of each row to be 300 pixels. And what you'll now see is that's just going to give me some additional space to work with. I will come back later on and also just update that to fit nicely around the content that I add within this repeating group. But for the time being, I'm just going to leave it at 300 pixels. And if you're working with repeating groups within the new Bubble Responsive Engine, what you'll find is that the process of finding the best design settings is just a matter of trial and error. So you'll just need to play around with the minimum and maximum width settings. But while I'm here, I'd also like to remove the style of this repeating group, just because if I scroll on down to the borders option, I just want to add a solid border around this repeating group, which just allows me to see where it actually sits on my page. I'm then going to select my repeating group once again, and I'm going to jump to my layout tab here, because I'll need to update the container layout of our repeating group. So because I'd like to add items in from top to bottom, I want this repeating group's container layout to be a column. I'm then going to want to center this repeating group within the center of my page, and I'm going to unselect that this repeating group should have a fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0. So that way it will of course expand or contract based on the width of my page at all times. And for the minimum height, I'm going to leave this at 350 for the time being, although I will come back and set that to 0 in a moment. And then under our layout tab, the very last thing I'd like to do is just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top of my repeating group. So that way it's just not touching the menu elements that I had previously added. And now within our repeating group, I'd like to add a card that displays the information of a room that's currently active within our Clubhouse application. And this will include things like the actual title of the room, who the creator is, if it's linked to a club, and also how many attendees and moderators this room has. And so as I mentioned, I'd like to store all of that information nicely within a card. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu here and add a group element into my repeating group. I'm going to jump over to my appearance tab here, and first thing I'm going to do is just remove the style of this group, because I'd like to update the background to be a flat color, and I'm going to leave this white. I'd also like to update the roundness of this group's borders to be 20, just so it has some actual curved borders. And then when it comes to the layout of this group, I'm going to update the container layout to be a column because I'll be stacking elements in this from top to bottom. And then I'm going to update the horizontal alignment to be centered within my repeating group cell. I'm also then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. And like always, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and the maximum width to be infinite. So that way this group will take up as much or as little space as it can within our repeating group cell. Of course, later on, I'll also be coming back to update the minimum height to 0, but I'll need to add in some elements into this group first. But the other thing I'd like to do is add a margin of 10 pixels around the entirety of this group. So I'm going to add 10 pixels at the top, 10 at the bottom, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. And what you'll see is now this group will no longer touch the borders of our repeating group that it sits within. And now within this group, I can start adding in the elements that I'll be displaying for this particular room. In order to do that though, I'm just going to need to select on my white group here and jump over to my appearance tab. And because I'd like to reference the information from our repeating group, so I'd like to display, as I mentioned, the title of that room as well as who the creator of that room is. What I'll need to do is actually pass on some data from my repeating group into my white group, which I can then reference within any text elements I add inside of it. And so for my white group here, I'm just going to need to update the type of content that it will store to be the value of a room. And for the data source, I would like it to receive the data from the repeating group cell it sits within. So I'm going to select that the data source should be the current cell's room. Nice and simple. From here, I'm then going to scroll on up to my visual elements and I'm going to add our very first text element into this group. And in this case, what I'd like to do is display the name of a club that this room is linked to. And I want this element to be hidden by default because I'll only want it to display if a club is actually linked to a room. Because of course, it's not mandatory to actually link a room to a club. But if someone would like to do that, I just want to display the information of that club that it is linked to. And so I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data here. And within this text element, I'd like to display the parent group's room, the original club that it is linked to, its name. I'm also then going to select on the next line here, I'll add a space. I'm going to open up my emoji keyboard. I'm on a Mac, so if you would like to open your emoji keyboard, you can hit the Control Command Space option. Of course, as I mentioned in the past, if you're using a Windows device, you can head to emojipedia.org and you can copy across any emojis you would like as text characters. And the emoji I'd like to select here is just the house emoji. I'm going to choose to add that in. And once I've added in the dynamic data for this text element, I would like to open up my rich text editor here. I'm going to highlight all of this text because I'd like to bold the formatting of this. I'll then choose to save that. I'm also then going to need to make this element responsive. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab here. And I'm going to start by unselecting that this element is fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite. And of course, I'll set the minimum height to be 0 because I have the option selected here to fit this element's height to the content within it. I'm also just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. And something else I'd like to do for this group is, as I mentioned before, create a condition that only allows this particular text element to be displayed if the room that's being created in our application is in fact linked to a club. So as I'd previously touched base on, it's not mandatory for a user to link a room to a club. And so if they have not done that, I do not want this text to be displayed within our overall group. So what I'm going to do is choose to unselect this option here that lists that this element is visible on page load. I'm also going to select the option to collapse this element when it's hidden, which just means that when it is not being displayed, any other elements below this will move up and take its place. I'm then going to jump over to our conditional tab here and I'm going to define a new condition. And I'm going to recognize if the parent group's room, so the parent group is the room stored within our white group, which is of course pulling data from our repeating group cell. if the parent group's room, its original club, is not empty, meaning that a club has in fact been linked to this room, I'm going to select that this element is visible, and I'd like to tick that that should be true. And that's all I'll need to configure for this element here. Below this, I'm now going to add in yet another text element that will display the name of the room. So I'm going to jump to my visual elements, I'll add in yet another text element, and within this element I'm going to be displaying the parent group's room, its title, or its name in this case. I'm then going to open up my rich text editor. I'd like to highlight all of this text and bold the formatting of that. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab because I'm going to need to make this responsive. And in order to do that, I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width. Like before, I'm going to set the minimum width to 0, the minimum height to also be 0, and then I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. And now below this text element, I'd like to display some additional details about this particular room. And I want this to be broken down into two different horizontal sections. So on the left-hand side, I'd like to display the profile photo of the person who has created this room. And then on the right-hand side, I'd like to display a list of all of the speakers within this room, as well as the number of attendees and moderators within this room. And now because I'd like to display these elements side by side, I'm going to need to add in yet another group within my existing group here, because I'll need to update the new group's container layout style to be a row, not a column, similar to what we'd done with our header at the top of our page. So I'm going to head to my containers menu here. I'm going to add in a group element. I'm going to jump to my appearance tab and just remove the style of this group, because I want to set the background color as a flat color, and I'll make this just another light shade of red for the time being. I'm then going to jump into my layout tab for this group, and I'd like to set the container layout to be a row, as I'd mentioned, because I'm going to be stacking items side by side. I'm then also going to unselect that this element is fixed width, set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite, and now you'll see it'll take its place within our existing white group here. And before I update the minimum height of this group, I'm going to start adding in all of the elements that will sit within it. And as I'd mentioned, the very first element I'd like to add is going to be an image of the person who has created this room. So I'm going to add in an image element here, and I would like to insert dynamic data. But before I can reference the person's profile photo, I'm just going to need to click on my red group here and add a type of content that it will be storing within it. So because this red group sits within my white group, I'm going to now need to pass the data from my white group through to my red group. So I'm going to update the type of content of my red group to be a room, and then I'll set the data source to be the parent group's room. And if you remember, because my red group sits within my white group, the white group is now the parent group, and of course that white group is pulling data from my repeating group. So you can see how all of these groups are now linked together and passing data through each other. I'm then going to click on my image within my red group here, and I can choose to display the parent group's room, the creator of that room, which is a person, their profile photo, and I'd like to process this image with ImgX because I want to resize the dimensions by cropping them. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab here, and I would like to update the width of this image to be 45 pixels. And I am going to keep this fixed width just because I don't want this image to expand or contract based on the size of my page. I'm always going to want this to be 45 pixels. I'm also going to tick this option here to keep this aspect ratio fixed, just so that way it becomes a perfect square. And instead of adding margins on this particular element here, what I could do is actually add my margins on the red group itself. So if I click back to my red group, I could scroll on down to my margins menu here and add 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left, 10 on the right, and even 10 on the bottom. And now that'll just ensure that my red group actually sits in line with any of the additional elements I've added within my overall white group here. The very last thing I want to do with my image though is just click back on it, open up my appearance tab, and I'd like to update the roundness of this image to be 10, and I'd like to set a solid border around this image, just so I can see where it actually sits within my group. And now once I've added my image into my red group here, I'd like to display a list of additional information about this room. And because I want to display this information next to my image here, but in a vertically stacked format, I'm going to need to add an additional group within my red group. So if I head to my containers menu here, I'm going to add in yet another group. I'm going to start by removing the style of this group, because I'd like to update the background to be a flat color. I'm going to, in this case, just select the color to be a light shade of blue. And again, the reason I'm doing this is because it just allows me to clearly visualize where each group sits on my page. Of course, before you publish or preview your application, you could update the colors and remove any stylings if you would like. But for the time being, I just think this is the best way to visualize where every element sits on my page. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab, and I'm going to update the container layout of this particular group to be a column, because I'll be stacking elements in this group from top to bottom, not side by side. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and the maximum width to be infinite. And now you'll see that this group itself sits nicely next to the profile photo of the person who created this room. And from here, the very first element I'd like to add within this group is going to be a repeating group that displays a list of all the people who are currently speakers within this room. So I'm going to jump to my containers menu once again, and I'm going to add in a repeating group element. For this repeating group, I'm going to set the container layout to be a column. I'm then going to jump into my appearance tab, and I'll need to add in a type of content. In this case, I'd like to display a list of users. And for the data source, I'm going to need to reference the information that's been passed on throughout all my groups. And of course, in order to do that, I need to store a data source on my blue group that this repeating group sits within. And in order to access my blue group, I can right click on my repeating group here, and I can choose the option to select its parent group, which is our group here, which is our blue group. I could even update the name of this to be called group blue. I'm then going to update its type of content to be a room. And I'm going to have this pull data from the red group that it sits within. So now we're passing data on once again. And now if I click on my repeating group element, for the data source, I'd like to display the parent group's room. It's a list of speakers, which is a list of users. I'd also like to unselect that this repeating group has a fixed number of rows, and I'll be updating the minimum height of these rows in a moment, but I am going to keep this option ticked here to make this a fixed number of columns, because I only want to display one line item within each repeating group cell. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab here, and I'm going to unselect that this repeating group should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, and I'll be coming back to update the minimum height in a moment. But from here, what I can do now is add in the name of the person who is the speaker within this room. So I'm going to add a text element within my repeating group here. And for this text element, I would like to display the current cell's user, their name, and then I'd like to add in an emoji beside this text. So I'm going to add in a space. I'm going to open up my emoji keyboard, and I'm going to choose to add in this speech bubble emoji. Again, if you're not using a Mac and if you don't have access to the emoji keyboard, head to Emojipedia and you'll be able to search and copy this emoji over. And now when it comes to this text element, I'm going to jump to my layout tab because I'd like to make this responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width, set the minimum width to be 0, the minimum height to be 0, just making sure I've ticked this option to fit the height of this element to the content within it. And then when it comes to the margin of this text element, I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels at the bottom. And that's all I'll need to structure for my text element here. I can now click on my repeating group that it sits within. I can remove its minimum height to be 0. I'll then jump back over to my appearance tab and set the minimum height of each row to also be 0. And what you'll now see is that my repeating group will collapse. Of course, that repeating group will always expand down based on how many speakers it needs to display. While I'm here, I'm also just going to choose to remove the style of my repeating group for the time being, just because I'm going to want to add a solid border around this so I can actually see where it sits on my page. I'm also just going to jump over to my layout tab one last time and just add 10 pixels of margin on the left of my repeating group, just so that way the text itself does not touch the image element beside it here. And that's all I'll need to configure for my repeating group element. The very last thing I'd like to add within my blue column group here is just a count of how many attendees are within this room, as well as how many people are moderators within this room. And so in order to do that, I'm just going to add a text element below our repeating group, and I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the parent group's room, the attendees, which is a list of users. I'm going to perform a count on how many people are in that list. I'm also then going to choose to add in an icon within my text element. And I'm going to show you a great little hack within Bubble that allows you to do that. So traditionally, if you wanted to add in an icon, you'd have to add in a separate element here. But if you want to add an icon within a text element, you can add in a little bit of HTML, which will just allow you to display those. What I'm going to do is just click on the next line here. I'm going to add in a space. And in order to include an icon, I'm going to add a open square bracket. I'm going to type in the letters FA followed by a closed square bracket. And then I can type in the name of the icon I would like to add. In this case, the name of the icon I want to add is called a user. I'm then going to need to add an open square bracket followed by a /. I'll then close off my FA text and then add a closed square bracket. And what you'll see is that that will now format to be a user icon here. I'm going to then add in a couple of spaces before I insert more dynamic data. And in this case, I'd like to display the parent group's room, the moderators, which is a list of users, the count of how many moderators are within that list. And I'll once again like to add in an icon beside this. So I'm going to add in a space. I will include a open square bracket followed by the letters FA and then a closed square bracket. And then I'm going to insert the name of the icon I would like to display. In this case, the icon is called commenting. I'm going to then add a open square bracket again, a /, an F, an A, and then a closed square bracket. And now you'll see that formatting will automatically update. And that's all of the text that I want to add within this particular element. The only thing I'll need to do is, of course, update the responsive settings of this element. So I'm going to jump over to my layout tab here. I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, the minimum height to be 0, making sure I tick this option here. And then for the margin, I would like to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 pixels of margin at the bottom, and also 10 pixels of margin on the left. And now that's all I would like to add within our group elements here. So I can start closing off the height of each group. So I'm going to click on my blue group here and I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0. And you'll see that that will now collapse around all of the text elements within it. I'm then going to click on my red group here and I'm going to set the minimum height of this group to be 0. And then finally, I'm going to select on my main white group here. And I would like to set the minimum height of this group to be 0. And then once I have closed off the height of my white group, I can click on my overall repeating group on the page. I can head to my layout tab of my repeating group and set the minimum height to be 0. And then if I jump over to the appearance tab, I'm also going to set the minimum height of each row to be 0. And as you'll see, that repeating group will collapse on our page. And although we can only see one cell of our repeating group here, this will continually expand down and display a list of all of the active rooms within our application. And of course, a user can select from any of those at any given time. While we're building out this homepage though, I would like to create a workflow that's triggered every single time our white card group is clicked. And in which case, I'd like to redirect a user through to a dedicated room page in our application, which is where that chat will currently be hosted. And so I'm going to click on my overall white group here and I'm going to choose to start edit a workflow. And within this workflow, I'm going to choose from a navigation event. I'm going to select the go to page option. And of course, this page does not yet exist in my application. So I'm going to create a new page here and I'll be calling this our room page. I'll create that. And now before I set the destination page to be our room page that we had just created, I'm going to need to open up our page drop-down menu here and jump over to my room page quickly. And the reason why I'm opening this page is because I'm just going to need to update the type of content that we'll be storing on this page. So because I want to display the information of a Clubhouse room within this page, I'm going to need to set the type of content to be a room, which will allow me to send and receive data through a workflow to this page. So that way my application knows which particular Clubhouse room it should display at any given time. And so if I jump back into my home page, open up my workflow editor here, and open up the workflow we were just building where the group was selected. Under the destination page, I'm going to set this to be the room page we've just added. And the data I would like to send through is the current cell's room. So that is the room that's listed within our repeating group cell that this group sits within. And that's how we can send data between pages within Bubble. It's actually a really straightforward process. If I jump back into my design tab though, there's just one last thing I'd like to add onto my home page, and that is just a menu that sits on the bottom of my page with a button that prompts a user to start a new Clubhouse room. And in order to add a menu on my page that is continually positioned at the bottom of the page, I'm going to use what's called a floating group. So if I head to my containers menu here, I'm going to choose to add a floating group onto my page. And the difference between a group and a floating group is that a floating group, while it acts like a normal group, it does not sit on your page. It in fact sits over the top of your page. So with my floating group here, if I was to remove the style of this and set a background style to be a flat color, what you'll see is that because it sits over my page, it's currently hovering over all of the additional elements I've added. And the reason why I'm using a floating group element is because you can choose where they hover on the page. So I would like to update the hover position to be at the bottom of my page. And what you'll now see is that my group is positioned on the bottom, as I just mentioned. And within my floating group, I'm just going to add in one element, and that's going to be a button element here. And this is going to display the words start a room. And then from here, I'm going to click back onto my floating group. I'm going to jump to my layout tab because I'd like to update the container layout style to be a column. I'm going to unselect that this element should have a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, keeping the maximum width at infinite like I always do. I'm then going to set the minimum height to be 0. And you'll now see that this floating group will collapse around the button that sits within it. I'm then going to jump to my appearance tab here because the very last thing I'd like to do is just update the color of my floating group. Instead of having this be a flat color, I'm actually going to make this a gradient, and I'm going to set the ending color to be the same color as our background, which is that cream Clubhouse color. If you'd like that color code, it's FFAED. And now you'll see that this floating group will actually blend in with my page quite nicely. I'm going to then click on my button element, jump to my layout tab, because I would like to align this horizontally in the center of my page. And now that's everything I would like to add on my home page for the time being. As much as I'd love to show you a preview of how this page functions right now, because we haven't actually built out the feature to create a new room within our application, there won't actually be any data that's displayed within our repeating group. So this page would almost be blank. So I'll be sure to come back at a later point in our tutorial and show you how this page functions. But for the time being, I'm just going to jump back over into my Notion doc because I want to check off that I've finished adding in all of the features for the homepage build of my Clubhouse application. After building out our homepage, the next feature that I want to focus on is the ability to create user profiles within our application. And now the reason I want to focus on building out user profiles before I touch base on how we can create a Clubhouse room is because on our user profile page, we're also going to allow users to eventually create a new club on that page, which will be my next module. And of course, it's helpful if a user has created a club before they create a room, because as I'd mentioned on my homepage, when someone creates a room, they can actually link that to an existing club. So essentially, this is the order that I wanted to follow throughout my tutorial today. And in order to get through that process, we're just going to need to start by creating a user profile page. And so I'm going to jump over into my bubble editor, and we're going to need to create a brand new page from scratch right now. So I'm going to add a new page within my editor, and I'm going to be calling this the profile page. I'm going to choose to create this. And on this page, the first thing you'll need to do is upgrade this page to be the new bubble responsive engine if you haven't done that. And then before I update any of the layout settings of my page, I'm just going to update the background color to be the same Clubhouse cream color that I added on my home page. If you'd like that color code again, it's FFAED. And after updating my background color, I'm going to jump to my layout tab, and I'll be updating the container layout of this particular page to be a column, because similar to all pages, we're going to be building them from top to bottom, not side to side. So the column container layout is the most appropriate layout in this instance. I'm also going to update the preset page width to be a mobile device, and that will update the width of my UI builder to be 380 pixels. And before I start adding any elements onto this page, I'm also just going to need to update the type of content that's displayed on this page. In this case, I'd like to select from the user option. Because we're displaying user profile information, I'm going to need to reference a user in which we'll be referencing on this page. And I'll be showing you how we can make good use of that as I start adding the elements onto my page. And so the very first element I'd like to add is under my visual elements. I'm going to add in an image. And this will be the profile photo of the person's profile that we're viewing. So I'm going to insert dynamic data here. And in this case, I'd like to display the current page user's profile photo. But before I select that, I just wanted to indicate to you the difference between the current user option and the current page user option. And so the difference is pretty straightforward. Let's say you're viewing someone's profile within an application. For this example, let's just say you're viewing my profile. You, in this instance, would be the current user because you're the person who is logged into your account. And I would be the current page user because I'm the person that's being displayed on the page. And so that's the difference between the two. And in this case, I'd like to display the current page user's profile photo because the current page user, as I mentioned, is the user whose profile we're viewing, not your profile photo. But one thing you need to remember is that if you were to view your own profile, you technically would be the current page user and also the current user. So regardless, your profile photo would be displayed when it's necessary. And so I'm going to select from the current page user option and I'm going to display their profile photo. I'm also going to process this image with Imgix just because I want to tick this option here that resizes and fits the dimensions of this image by cropping them. I'm then going to close this. I'm also just going to update the border of my image here to be a solid border. And I'll set the roundness of this image to be 20, just so it has some curved edges. And then if I jump over to my layout tab, I can update the responsive settings of this image. The first thing I'm going to do is update the width of this image to be 80 pixels. And now I will be keeping this image fixed width because I don't want it to expand or retract based on the size of the page. I'm always going to want it to be 80 pixels. I'll also select to keep this aspect ratio fixed for this element, so that way it's going to be 80 pixels by 80 pixels. And then when it comes to the margins, I'm going to add 30 pixels of margin at the top and 20 pixels of margin on the left. And as you'll see, that will now position my image on the page quite nicely. And now below this profile photo, I'm going to add in a button that will allow someone to follow and unfollow a user's profile that they're viewing. So under my visual elements, I'm going to add in a button element here. And on this, I'm going to display the word follow. I'm then going to update the style of this button. I'm going to choose from our secondary button here. And then I'm going to edit the style because I want to create my own custom style here that we're going to be using multiple times throughout our application. And when it comes to my own style, I'm going to start by updating the text here to be a blue color I have. If you would like that color code, it's 1B7, 1BD. I'm then going to update the background color here to be white. And then I'm going to set a solid border around this button. And then I'm going to paste in yet again the same color code that I had used for the text color. And then finally, I'm going to update the roundness of the borders here to be 20. And if we jump back into our design tab, you'll now see that this looks like the follow button style that Clubhouse uses within their app. I'm then going to need to jump to my layout tab because of course I'd like to update the responsive settings and the size of this button. And in this case, I'm going to set the width of this button to be 120 pixels. I'm going to keep this fixed width because I don't want this to expand out. I'm also going to update the height to be 35 pixels. And then I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top and 20 pixels of margin on the left. And what I'd like to do now is build out a workflow that runs every single time that this follow button is clicked, in which case I would like to allow someone to follow the user whose profile they're viewing. So I'm going to choose to start a workflow here. And every single time this button is clicked, I'm going to head to my data tab because I'd like to make changes to a thing. The thing I would like to change is the current page user. So that is the person's profile that we're currently viewing. I'd like to update their list of followers, which of course is a list of users. And in this case, I'll be adding to that list the current user. So once again, the current user is the person who's logged in viewing this person's profile. What I'd also like to do though is add an additional step within this workflow. I'm going to head to my data tab once again, and I'm going to make changes to a thing. The thing I'd like to change in this case is the current user. So that is the person who has just followed this new user. And in this case, I'm going to update their list of users that they follow. And I'm going to be adding to it the current page user. So that is the person's profile that they're viewing, and they've just selected to follow. And then if I was to jump over to my design tab, what I could do is add a condition onto this button that just updates the text here to display the word following if the current user is following the person's profile that they're viewing. So I'm going to jump to my conditional tab here, and I'm going to define a new condition. And within this condition, I'm going to recognize if the current page user, if their list of followers contains the current user, so the person who's logged in viewing their profile, I'd like to update the text of this button, and I'd just like to display the word following instead of follow. And what I love about Bubble is that you can choose to toggle these conditions on and off here, so that way you can see what this looks like. But let's say a user has selected to follow this person's profile, the condition would become true and it would display the word following. But later on throughout their time in the platform, they might choose to unfollow this user. What we're going to need to do is create a separate workflow that's going to run to create that action. And so if I jump over into my workflow tab here, I'm going to create a new workflow. And similar to before, I'm going to want this to run whenever my follow button is clicked. So if I head to my element triggers here, I'm going to select the an element is clicked option. The element will of course be our follow button. And in this case, instead of adding a user to a list of followers, I'm going to want to remove them. So I'm going to head to my data tab and I'm going to make changes to a thing again. The thing I'd like to change first is the current page user. In this case, I'm going to select from their list of followers, and instead of adding the current user, I'm now going to remove the current user. And then I'm going to add an additional workflow step. I'm going to choose to make changes to a thing again. Only in this case, the thing I want to change is the current user. And I'll be updating their list of following field, in which case I'll be removing from it the current page user. And now one thing I will point out is that at this point in time, both of these workflows have the exact same trigger. So what we're going to need to do is create a condition on each workflow that only allows it to run when the right behavior should happen. So on my right here, I have my workflow that's going to remove a follower. And I'm obviously only going to want this to run when a user is already following someone's profile. So on the workflow trigger itself, I'm going to add a condition here. And I'm going to recognize that this should only ever run when the current page user, when their list of followers does contain the current user, this workflow will run and it will allow them to unfollow that user. And because we're unfollowing a user, I'm going to update the event color here to be red. So that way I know that that is the particular workflow that unfollows someone. If I then jump to my original workflow, I'm going to add a condition on the workflow trigger that only allows this workflow to run if the current page user, if their list of followers does not already contain the current user, I'm of course going to add them to that list. And because this workflow actually allows someone to follow someone, I'm going to update the event color to be green, and that will just allow me to easily differentiate between the two. And that's all we'll need to build out for our following feature. I'm then going to start building out the rest of my profile page. So below our follow button here, I'm going to add in a text element onto the page. And within this text element, I'd like to display the name of this user. So I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the current page user, their name. I'm also going to open up our rich text editor, highlight that text and choose to bold the formatting of it. I'll choose to save that. I'm then going to need to make this element responsive on my page. So I'm going to head to my layout tab here. I'll start by unselecting that this element is fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, the minimum height to be 0. And then I'm going to add in a margin of 10 at the top of this, and then 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 on the right. And that'll now just ensure that it does not touch both the borders of my page. And then below this, I'm going to just copy this text element because I'd now like to display the handle of this user. And so I'm just going to remove all of this dynamic data here. I'm going to add in an @ symbol. And now I'd like to insert dynamic data and display the current page user, their username, which of course is their unique identifier. And now below this text element, I'm going to make another copy of this. And in this case, I'd like to display a count of how many followers this person's profile has, as well as how many people they're following. So I'm going to remove all of this dynamic data. I'm going to insert some new dynamic data and display the current page user, their list of followers, the count of how many people are in that list. I'm then going to add in a space and type in the word followers. I just need to add in an F there. I'm then going to add in a couple of spaces here because I'd like to then insert dynamic data and display the current page user, their list of people who they're following, the count of how many people are in that list. And then I'm going to add a space and type in the word following. And when it comes to the actual formatting of this text element, I'm going to want to bold the count of followers and people that they're following. So I'm going to open up my rich text editor here, and I'm going to highlight the count of the followers, but not the word followers. I'm going to choose to bold the formatting of that. I'm then going to do the same for my following count. I'm going to highlight that text, choose to bold that. I'll then save this. And now below this, I'd like to add in a text element that displays the user's bio. So I'm going to copy this text element here. I'm going to remove all of this dynamic data, and I'm going to insert new dynamic data and display the current page user, their bio. It's as simple as that. And now below this, I'll be copying this text element once again, only this time I'll be displaying a static heading. And this is just going to indicate that I'd like to display this user's selected topics that they follow on this platform. So I'm going to just remove all of this dynamic data, and I'm going to add in the word favorite topics. And then below this, I'm of course going to want to display a list of all the topics that they've selected that they're interested in. And in order to do that, I'm going to use the multi-select drop-down menu to display a list of all of the topics they've selected from our option set list. So at this point in my tutorial, I have installed a plugin called the multi-select dropdown. Of course, if you haven't yet installed that, you'll just need to open up your plugin library and type in the word multi-select, and you'll be able to install this free plugin, which is built by Bubble. I'm then going to jump into my design tab here, and if I scroll on down to my input forms, I'll now see the option to add in a multi-drop-down input field. I'm going to add this onto my page. I'm just going to update the name of this to be called multi-drop-down topics. And then when it comes to the data I'd like to display within this input field, I'm going to display a list of all the topics that a user has referenced that they are interested in. And so I'm going to update the choices style for this multi-select dropdown to be a list of dynamic choices, because I'm going to be referencing the topics that a user has saved within their database for their account. The type of choices I'll be displaying is a list of topics, which if you remember in our database under our option sets menu, we had added in an option set called topic, which displays a list of static topics that users could choose from. I'm going to jump back into my design tab here, and I'd like to reference all of the topics from our option set list and display the display text for the option set, which is just the name of each option. So if the name was startups, it's going to display the word startups. But for the default value here, what I'm going to want to do is only display the topics that a user has already selected. So these are the topics that they've chosen they're interested in on our platform. So for the default value here, I would like to display the current page user, their list of interested topics. And if you remember in our database, that was a list that was linked to our option sets. The other thing I'm going to do here is select that this input should be disabled, because in this case, I only want to display a list of a user's interested topics. I don't want someone to be able to update and change the topics that someone is interested in. I'm then going to scroll on down to the style of this input field. And for the background style here, I'm going to set this to be none. And then for the border, I'm going to select that this should also be none. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm only going to want to display a list of all of the tiles which indicate the topics that are being displayed. I actually don't want this multi-line input to look like an input. Instead, I want it to just display data, not give users the impression that they can select any options from this list. But before I show you a test of how this functions, of course, I'm just going to need to update the responsive settings of my multi drop-down here. So I'm going to head to my layout tab. I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0. I'm going to keep the minimum height at 45 pixels here, making sure that I have selected the option to fit the height of this content. And the reason why I'm keeping the minimum height at 45 pixels is because I want it to, at minimum, be this height. I'm then going to add in 15 pixels of margin on the left. And one thing I just want to point out is that I'm not going to add 20 pixels like all of the additional elements on my page, just because with the multi-line drop down, as I mentioned, it's going to display a list of tiles. And between the border of the input and the first tile, there's about 5 pixels of space. So I'm just going to factor that additional space in there. One thing I will do though is add 20 pixels of margin on the right, just so that way it does line up with the elements on my right-hand side here. And at this point, we're making some solid progress across our user profile page. The next thing I'd like to do is display a list of all of the clubs that this user is a member of, as well as give the user the ability to create a new club if they're viewing their own profile. And so what I'd like to do is, before I add in a repeating group element and display a list of all the clubs that this person belongs to, what I'm going to do is add in a title on my left-hand side here that displays that they're a member of the clubs below. But then next to that element on the right-hand side, I'm going to add in some text that's going to act as a button, and that will prompt the user to create a new club. And because I want both of those elements to sit side by side, I'm going to need to add in a group with the container layout of a row. And so I'm going to scroll on up to my containers menu here. I'm going to choose to add in a group. I'm going to head to my appearance tab first and remove the style of this group. I'm going to update the background to be a flat color, and I'll just set the color to be a light shade of red so I can see where it actually sits on my page. And within this group, I'm going to add in both of those text elements. But before I do that, I need to jump over to my layout tab and update the container layout to be a row, because I'll be stacking items side by side. I'm then going to scroll on up to my visual elements and add in my first text element. And this will just display the word member of with a semicolon beside it. And then I'm going to update the responsive settings of this text element. I'm going to head to my layout tab and unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, but instead of leaving the maximum width to be infinite, I'm going to set this to be 100. And the reason I'm doing that is because I don't want this element to infinitely take up as much space as it possibly can, because beside this, I'm going to add in an additional text element. And I want to control the proximity of how close that second text element is to our first one. And I'll be showing you what I mean in a moment. Before I do that though, I'm just going to update the minimum height here to be 0. And I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left, so this text element aligns with all the additional text elements on my page. And now from here, I'm going to add in yet another text element. And what you'll now see is that because I have a maximum width of 100 pixels on my first text element, the second text element sits at the border of where that element lies. And now if both of these text elements had an infinite max width, they would equally take up half of the space within my red group. So that way they would be spaced out quite a bit, whereas I want these to actually be close together. And now within this text element, I'm going to display the words create a club, which is going to act like a button where a user can prompt a pop-up to create a new club. But before I do that, I'd just like to add in a plus icon within this text element. And of course, in order to add in an icon, I'm going to need to add an open square bracket followed by the letters FA and then a closed square bracket. And then I'm going to need to type in the actual name of the icon I'd like to add, which is just a plus icon. And then going to add an additional open square bracket followed by a /, the letters FA, and then a closed square bracket. And you'll now see that that will update to be a plus icon. And now I'd like to add in the text create a club. And when it comes to the styling of this text, I'm just going to remove the default style because I would like to bold this text and also update the color of this to be the shade of blue that I've used for my follow button here. If you'd like that color code again, it's 1B7, 1BD. And from here, I'm going to jump over to my layout tab because I'd like to update the responsive settings of this text element. And when it comes to the responsive settings here, I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0. I can leave the maximum width to be infinite. I'm then going to update the minimum height to be 0. And then that's all I'll need to configure when it comes to our text elements here. I can then choose to open up my red group that they sit within. I can update the layout settings of this. So I'm going to update the minimum width here. I'm going to update the width settings here. I'll remove that I want this to be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leave the maximum width to be infinite, and then I will set the minimum height to also be 0. The only other thing I'd like to do is just scrolling down to my margin settings because I'd like to add 20 pixels of margin at the top of this group. So that way it just spaces it away from the topics that are being displayed within that multi-line input field. And now below this, I can add in a list of all of the clubs that a user is a member of. Before I do that though, I'm just going to select on my overall page and I'm going to update the minimum height here to just be 700 pixels. That's just going to give me a little bit of extra space I can work within. Of course, we can come back and change that at a later time once we've finished adding in all of our elements. But at the bottom of our page here, I'd like to display a list of all of the clubs that a user has joined. And of course, because we're working with a list, that means I'm going to need to add in a repeating group element. So I'm going to head to my containers menu here. I will add in a repeating group and I'll update the container layout style of this repeating group to be a column because I'll be stacking any items in this from top to bottom. I'm also going to jump over to my appearance tab first before I update any additional responsive settings. And I'm going to select that within this repeating group, I would like to display a list of clubs. And then when it comes to the clubs I would like to display, I want to show the current page user their list of joined clubs. And then when it comes to the number of rows and columns I'd like to display within this repeating group, I actually want this repeating group to be what's called a horizontal scrolling repeating group, which just means that instead of scrolling vertically from top to bottom in this repeating group, users will be able to scroll horizontally across all of the options that are displayed. And in order to create that configuration, I'm just going to need to unselect that I want a fixed number of rows and a fixed number of columns. And then I'll have the ability to choose the scroll direction of my repeating group. I'm going to select that this should be the horizontal option. And then when it comes to the minimum height of each row, I'm just going to update this to be 300 pixels. And what you'll now see is that we have quite a bit of space to work within here. Like always, when I'm working with repeating groups though, I'm most likely going to have to come back and update the minimum settings here. Just because when it comes to repeating groups, I find that sometimes you just need to play around with some of the settings in order to find the exact configurations that work. Of course, I'll be walking you through my whole thought process though. What I am going to also do is jump over to my layout tab here, I'm going to unselect that this repeating group should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0. I'll leave the minimum height at the moment as it is. Of course, I'll be coming back to update that later on. And then within each repeating group cell, I'm going to add in a group element that will act like a container. So I'm going to add a group into this. I'll set the container layout of this group to be a column because I'll be stacking elements in this from top to bottom. I'll jump over to my Appearance tab and just remove the style of this group. I'll set the background style to be a flat color, and I am going to keep this as white. I'm also just going to update the roundness of this group to be 20, so that way the borders are curved. If I then jump over into my Layout tab here, I'm going to unselect that this repeating group should be fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, and I'll be updating the minimum height in a moment. But what I'd also like to do is add 10 pixels of margin around every single border for this group, so that way it never touches the edges of my repeating group. And now within each group here, I'm going to display some details about each different club that a user is a member of. And so the first thing I'd like to add in is just an image of the club. So I'm going to add in an image element here. And before I can choose to reference a dynamic image, I'm going to need to store some data within my white group that this sits within. So I'm going to click on my container group here, and I'll update the type of content to be a club, and I'll set the data source to be the current cell's club. So that's the cell that it sits within my repeating group. I'm then going to click back on my image here. I can insert dynamic data, and I'd like to display the parent group's club, its featured image. I'm going to process that with ImgX, and I'll select to resize the dimensions by cropping them. I'm then going to jump to my border style and set a solid border around this image for the time being, just so I can see where it actually sits within my group. And then I'll also update the roundness of this border to be 20, so that way the edges are curved. I'm then going to jump into my layout menu here, and I'd like to align this image in the center of my white group. And I will update the width of this image to be 80 pixels. And I will also select that I want to keep the elements aspect ratio fixed, so that way it is a perfect square. And then I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top of this image, so that way it doesn't touch the very top of my white card group. And now below this, of course, I'd like to display the name of this club. So I'm going to insert a text element here, and I would like to insert dynamic data and display the parent group's club, the name of that club. And I would like to bold this text. So I'm going to open up our rich text editor here, highlight all of this text, and choose to bold the formatting of that. I'm then going to choose to save this. I'm going to remove the style of this text because I also just want to make sure that the text within this element is aligned in the center. I'm then going to need to jump over to my Layout tab here, because I would like to now align this overall element in the center of my white group. And then I would like to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0. I'll also update the minimum height to be 0, making sure I have selected this option to fit the height of this element to the content within it. And then I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, and then 10 pixels of margin on the left, as well as 10 pixels of margin on the right. And now you'll see that my overall group is expanding to fit in that text. And then finally, there's one last text element I would like to add within this group. And that is just an element that displays the total number of members within this particular club. So I'm going to head to my visual elements here. I'm going to add in a text element. I'm then going to insert dynamic data. And I'd like to perform a search through my database for all of the users whose list of clubs that they've joined contains the parent group's club. So that is the club within my white group here. And so now I'll be able to have Bubble calculate how many people have joined this particular club. And I'd like to, of course, display a count of that. And then I'm going to add in a space and type in the word members. I'm then going to remove the style of this element because I'd like to align this text within the center of it. I'm going to then jump over to my Layout tab here, and I'd like to align the overall element within the center of my white parent group. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, the minimum height to also be 0, and and then I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels of margin on both the left and right of this element. And I'll also just need to add in 20 pixels of margin at the bottom, because I'm now going to select on my white parent group here. I'm going to update the minimum height to be 0. And from here, what I can do is then finish configuring the settings of my overall repeating group. So I'm going to click on my repeating group here that this card sits within. I'm going to update the minimum height of this to be 0. I'm then going to jump over into my appearance tab here, because I'd like to update the minimum width of my column to now be 0, because I've added in some content within this, which just means that it's going to automatically scale based on the width of whatever group is added within this cell. And then when it comes to the minimum height of the row, I'm just going to try and reduce this to be 250 pixels. And one thing I found with horizontal repeating groups is that they can sometimes be a little tricky to configure the height of each row. I personally like to just preview the application and see how much empty space I have at the bottom of my repeating group. And then I'll come back and just customize the actual height itself. Of course, when I preview this page though, unfortunately, because we hadn't actually created a club yet, we won't have any options displayed within our repeating group. So that just means that the repeating group will be blank. But once we have created a club, we can come back and change the settings of that at any given time. But for the time being, that's everything I would like to add onto this page. So let's jump over into a preview of our application, and we can now see how this page functions, as it'll display the full information that a user has added within their profile. Over in my bubble editor here, I'm currently viewing this page on a desktop browser. If I would like to reduce the width of my browser here, what you'll see is that my page is displaying all of the information about my account. So that includes things like my name, my handle, my bio, and as you can see, also a list of all the topics that I've indicated that I'm interested in. If I would like to, let's say, follow my own account here, I can click that button, that workflow will run, and as you can see, the count of my followers and people I'm following has been updated. If I would like to unfollow myself, that workflow will run again, and it will change those numbers. And then down the bottom, as I mentioned before, because we haven't had the chance to actually build the workflow to create a new club yet, there's currently no clubs being displayed under my account. But of course, once I walk you through the process involved in creating a club, you'll be able to see a list of all of the clubs that a user is a member of. Back in my Notion checklist, I'm going to tick off that we've finished building out our user profile page, which, as I mentioned, is a predecessor for the next feature we're going to be building out, which is the ability to create a club within our application. And unfortunately at this point, that is all I have time for within our YouTube tutorial here today. As you can see, although this video was quite long and extensive, we've barely scraped the surface in what's possible when we're building our Clubhouse clone. So I'd always recommend to hit the link in the description below to purchase the full course if you'd like to bring the rest of your product to life. The full tutorial will explain everything you need to know to complete the rest of your Clubhouse build. And of course, that'll include the ability to create live chat rooms where users can actually speak to each other. In the meantime, though, I just want to say a massive thank you for sitting through this YouTube tutorial. And if you'd like to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources that I post, be sure to hit that subscribe button below so that way you don't miss any future updates. As for now, though, I wish you all the best on your own no-code journey.